A neat little house, picture-perfect smiles, the kind of couple you'd expect to see framed in wedding photos and in magazines, not in police files. But they looked like a dream, like the dream, young, attractive, and confident. But behind closed doors, beneath the rehearsed charm and the fairy tale life, something was off, and these monsters didn't just hide in the shadows. They were center stage in the spotlight. This is the story of the Barbie and Ken killers. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume. And I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. I put a little sauce on it for you today. But today we are, in all seriousness, talking about a very disturbing case, one that took place in Canada. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach speed down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this case together. A neat little house, picture-perfect smiles, the kind of couple you'd expect to see framed in wedding photos and in magazines, not in police files. But they looked like a dream, like the dream, young, attractive, and confident. But behind closed doors, beneath the rehearsed charm and the fairy tale life, something was off. And these monsters didn't just hide in the shadows. They were center stage in the spotlight. This is the story of the Barbie and Ken killers. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume. And I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. I put a little sauce on it for you today. But today we are, in all seriousness, talking about a very disturbing case, one that took place in Canada. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach speed down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this case together. I'd like to take a moment to talk about what I've been doing lately, and I have been slowly upgrading my spaces. An article has made it ridiculously easy. I picked up a couple of mid-century modern pieces, and the quality hit me immediately. The weight, the craftsmanship, the fact that it basically came assembled, which I like a lot. It actually feels like real furniture, not something that's going to fall apart in 6 months. And what I love is that everything article offers is curated. No filler, no throwaway pieces. It all just works together, so you can mix and match without your place looking like a random furniture showroom. Plus, their customer care team is available 7 days a week, and they even offer free interior design help, which comes in clutch if you're very indecisive like myself. An article is offering our listeners $50 off your purchase of $100 or more, so just visit article. KallMeKris, and the discount is applied automatically at checkout. That's article. KallMeKris. Thank you to Article for sponsoring this video, letting me get amazing furniture, and for supporting the channel. And let's get back to it. Tammy Lynn Homolka was born in Port Credit, Mississauga, Ontario, on New Year's Day, 1975. It was a birthday forever tied to celebration and the promise of new beginnings, and she would be the youngest of 3. Karla came first, and then Lori would follow, and then Tammy arrived 5 years after Karla, quickly defining her place as the baby in the family. And as a child, she was always moving. She ran and played and competed, and sports came very naturally to her. And people noticed her abilities really early on, so athletics were a part of her identity at that point. And her childhood as a whole appeared very stable and unremarkable, in the best way. And her family would go on vacations, and those vacations were spent out on Osler Lake's Ari, if I'm saying that wrong, where they would pass the days with swimming on campfires and shared meals, just a simple kind of life, but beautiful. And Tammy looked up to her older sisters, especially Karla, and she wanted to be near her constantly, following her around, admiring everything that she did. But Karla, on the other hand, tried keeping her distance, more just tolerating her rather than embracing her, which is a pretty common sisterly dynamic, especially at around that age. She just wanted her independence. She didn't want to be a babysitter all the time. So by 1990, Tammy was already 15 years old, a grade 10 student at Sir Winston Churchill Secondary School in St. Catharines. And her life followed a very steady schedule of school during the week in sports, whenever she could possibly play them. And soccer was her biggest passion, but she also loved track and field and cross country, and she would obviously excel at all of them. But the Homolka household was welcoming, and Carol, Tammy's dad, worked as a traveling salesman, and he was known for his easygoing manner and general friendliness to her. And he also had a really thick accent and a very contagious laugh. And Dorothy, Tammy's mom, worked as a hospital secretary and managed the home. And Karla, Tammy's sister, described her as a super mom, capable of anything and everything and everything. So the family would move around a few times before settling on Dundonald Street in Street Catherine's, and they built a swimming pool in the backyard, which became a gathering place in their home. And people would constantly come over, making summers loud and really busy. But Christmas time was the true heart of the Homolka family calendar, because year after year, the house would fill with relatives, neighbors, friends, and anyone that could attend. So the door was always open, with Carol and Dorothy ready to hand you a drink at any moment. And somewhere in the midst of all the merriment, a photo of the three sisters would be taken, shoulder to shoulder, kneeling and smiling in front of the tree. And these sorts of photos filled their photo albums, and each daughter seemed to have her own role in the household. And Karla would be known as the smart one, and Lori would be the social one, and Tammy was the athlete, of course, and she would fully embody that role. And on top of that, Tammy was also outgoing and just full of enthusiasm, and willing to fully throw herself into whatever she did. And also, she was deeply caring, doing anything to help the one she loves. So this holiday season was shaping up to be just like the rest. The family was gathered on the evening of December 23rd, decorations were up, and the home videos captured laughter and joyful moments. But at some point during the evening, Tammy ventured down to the basement rec room. And Karla was there, and so was Paul. Now, Paul was her fiancé, that had become a regular part of the family. And at this point in the night, Tammy's parents had gone to bed upstairs, and Lori was elsewhere in the house. So Tammy's loved ones were all near, the people she really trusted the most, and all seemed to be merry and bright. But before we get into what happened next, we need to understand who Karla really was. So the 5-year separation in age between Karla and Tammy shaped the relationship from the very beginning. And by the time Tammy was old enough to follow her older sister around, Karla had already decided she existed on a whole different level. She was older, she was above it all, and even though they lived in the same house and answered to the same parents, in Karla's mind, they didn't live in the same world. Yet when Karla suffered from asthma attacks, it was usually Tammy who stayed by her side, helping her through them. And Tammy would do anything for anyone, but especially for Karla, cause she looked up to her as an older sister. And as the girls got older, the Homolka household grew louder and busier, and boys started coming around more frequently. And to anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a vibrant home full of outgoing teenage girls. And Karla was described as someone with deep sensitivities around rivalry and humiliation. She needed to feel superior, and as Tammy grew into adolescence, healthy and athletic and naturally likable in ways that Karla simply was not, the gap between them became harder to ignore. But Karla was the eldest daughter, and with that position come certain responsibilities and privileges. And by the time both her sisters arrived, she had become used to being the center of attention. And her childhood looked quite different from Tammy's, not because of a difference in parenting style, but due to her own interests and strengths, because Karla wasn't drawn to the world of sports or physical activity, but instead enjoyed more intellectual pursuits. So while Tammy would effortlessly move through the outside world, Karla turned inward. And she'd spend hours reading and drawing, building worlds in her head, controlling the stories. And her health also brought its share of complications because Karla suffered from chronic asthma, and the attacks could be rather serious, and sometimes it would be brought on by nothing more than excitement, and sometimes severe enough to land her in the hospital. But with illness came attention, and with pain came care, and at some point Karla learned a lesson about vulnerability. It could be a tool to make people focus on you. And she quickly demonstrated her intelligence in school, where her teachers recognized her smarts when she was still very young. and she would learn to read faster than most, and later testing showed her IQ to be above 130, and her memory was exceptional, and she just absorbed information like a sponge. And Karla also understood that she was different from those around her, and she believed she was special because of it, or better than people because of it. Cause at one point after Paul, Karla's fiancé, had entered the picture, Tammy showed affection towards him, and the two sisters clashed openly. And whether Karla was consciously aware of any other building resentment is impossible to know, but the groundwork was laid down. So Karla went to the same school Tammy would later attend, Sir Winston Churchill Secondary School in St. Catharines, and she continued to thrive academically, and teachers took a liking to her because she spoke up in class and carried herself with confidence, rarely seeming uncertain about anything. But she wasn't part of the popular crowd necessarily, and had no interest in being part of it because, remember, she thought she was kind of above everyone. And in her mind, she was just meant for something bigger, something beyond her classmates and current circumstances. So people who knew her in those years described her as stubborn and strong-willed. And once Karla set her sights on something, she didn't let go until she had it. So she wasn't easily intimidated by anyone. And her interests shifted as she got older. And the childhood books gave way to romance novels, then to mystery novels, and she allegedly became obsessed with crime after discovering Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. And she started writing her own stories, and a theme emerged, and nearly all of them centered on a girl who was adored, a princess type claimed by someone who would never let her go. And when Karla became interested in something, she fully consumed it. And friends noticed the intensity, and some found it unsettling. And she immersed herself in Michael Jackson's Thriller music video, watching it hundreds of times. And she wanted to be Olivia Newton-John, dressing and dancing just like her during this time. And there were incidents during those years that stuck with people, like she threw a friend's pet hamster from a second-story window, and it took the hamster 2 weeks to die afterwards. And her NEA, Karla's friend, noted that she, quote, showed no remorse, and looked like she enjoyed the whole thing, unquote. Dear fucking God. And Karla later made her NEA dig up the hamster after it was buried so she could mess with it. Red freaking flagged. And she also snuck out to dig up her cat Mishka at one point just to see what the dead body looked like. And at the same time, Karla projected a completely different image, cause she loved animals and talked about wanting to become a veterinarian someday. And in class, she refused to harm insects, even dissecting a worm. And she once told some boys in her class, quote, you shouldn't kill it. It's wrong to kill anything, unquote, when they were about to step on a beetle. So to anyone on the outside, she seemed very gentle and compassionate, but both versions of Karla existed at once. And she experienced mood swings, and one friend noted, quote, at times she seemed elated, and at other times she would hardly speak at all for weeks at a time, unquote. And by her mid-teens, she had started experimenting with sex and with drugs and with older boys. And relationships came and went quickly because she got bored pretty easily. Cause what she wanted was something that felt bigger than ordinary life, something exciting in her eyes. And she even formed the exclusive Diamond Club with her friends, where they talked about moving to California, and a rich man's engagement ring would be their ticket to anywhere outside of St. Catharines. And she also found interest in the occult, reading books about witchcraft, and her favorite book was allegedly about satanic abuse. And by the time she was 17, Karla had taken a job at a pet shop inside the Penn Center Mall. So perfectly aligning with the vision of herself she wanted people to see as responsible, intelligent, and gentle with animals. And then she would finish high school and receive acceptance letters from universities, but turn them all down because university just felt too slow for her, too confining because she wanted more. She's just always wanted more. And around the same time, her relationship with her father began to worsen. And she saw him as weak, a man who didn't measure up to the life she had already started imagining for herself. Because she wanted a man who could fulfill her fantasies that had been living in her mind for as long as she could remember. And growing up, Karla had collected dozens of Barbie and Ken dolls, and she loved everything about them. Quote, because everything about them was just so perfect. From Barbie's hair to house, even her underwear, It was a wonderful pretend family in a beautiful pretend world, unquote. And now in her teens, she projected that perfection and pure image to the outside world. Meanwhile, she continued exploring her sexuality, with a special appreciation for kinky sex, trying out handcuffs and more. And Karla would love dirty talk, quote unquote. And even with that pristine outer-facing image, later psychiatric evaluations would claim, quote, Homolka remains something of a diagnostic mystery. Despite her ability to present herself very well, there is a moral emptiness in her which is difficult, if not impossible, to explain, unquote. So by the fall of 1987, Karla's desperation for something greater was at an all-time high. But little did she know, she was about to meet Paul Bernardo. So Paul Kenneth Bernardo was born the youngest of 3 kids on August 27th, 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario, and on paper, the Bernardos seemed respectable. His father Kenneth worked as an accountant, while his mother Marilyn had grown up in a stable, affluent household after being adopted as a young child. But inside the home, it was a different story entirely. Kenneth was violent and verbally cruel, and he belittled his wife openly, calling her a bitch and a big fat cow. But that was the least of his offenses, because he was a predator. Because in 1975 he was charged with child molestation, and he was known around the neighborhood as a peeping Tom, and he even sexually abused his own daughter. And he even essayed his own daughter, and sometimes in front of other family members. This man was a monster. So the abuse didn't happen in secret. It happened openly and brazenly, as if the rules that governed other families simply didn't apply to theirs. So he made no effort to hide it, and no one stopped him either. And the neighbors knew him too for who he truly was. They called him a peeping Tom, cause they would catch him lurking outside windows after dark. The police are a thing in this era. What's going on here? Call the cops? And luckily someone did, and in 1975 he was charged with child molestation after saw a girl who lived nearby. So the household Paul grew up in was dysfunctional, to say the least. It was actually just predatory, and young Paul was watching, and young Paul was learning, absorbing lessons about what men were allowed to do in his mind and about what they could get away with. And Marilyn, for her part, battled severe depression and anxiety, and as the years passed, she pulled further and further away from the family, becoming isolated. But the most damaging truth of all remained buried, because Paul was not actually Kenneth's biological son, because Marilyn had conceived him during an affair years earlier, and the secret had been kept from Paul his entire childhood. Yet, even before anyone told him, Paul seemed to sense something was off, cause he always felt like he didn't quite belong, like he was being treated differently, and that unease would never leave him. And despite the chaos at home doors, Paul learned to perform, and he was polite and smiled easily, and adults found him charming and well-mannered. And he joined the Scouts and during the Chief Scout Ord even, and he later worked as a camp counselor where parents trusted him and the kids loved him. But there were early signs, and around the age of 10 he and friends started setting fires with magnifying glasses, and he learned very early how to split himself into. And the gap between the boy people saw and the life he actually lived became one of the defining features of who he really was, similar to who Karla was. But Paul went to Sir Wilfrid Laurier High School in Scarborough and graduated in 1982. And from there he enrolled at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus to study accounting, following in his father's footsteps. And physically he drew attention as a tall, blonde, impeccably groomed young man. He looked like someone people trusted instinctively. Not me. I don't trust adult blonde men at out of the gate. At least I don't know what it is. I just don't. Okay, I feel like a lot of us can agree if you're an adult man with blonde hair. Sorry, this doesn't apply to you. You're a good person if you watch this channel automatically, anyway. But before college at the age of 16, Paul's world would shift, and during a heated argument between his parents, Marilyn told Paul the truth about his father. Kenneth was not his real dad. And Paul met the situation with immediate disgust followed by rage, and he turned on his mother, hurling the same degrading insults he had spent his childhood hearing inside of the house. And the revelation did more than just anger him. It shattered the already fragile foundation of his identity, because for years Paul sensed something was off, that he was treated differently and that he didn't quite belong. And now he understood why, cause he wasn't Kenneth's son. He was the product of his mother's affair, living proof of her betrayal. So the man who had raised him, the man whose footsteps he had followed into accounting, wasn't even his real father. And some who studied Paul later would point to this moment as a psychological turning point. The moment when whatever fragile sense of self he had constructed just came apart and something darker took place. And he began calling his mother the horror of the world, and she would call him a bastard from hell. God, this family, just evil bad family. So the words just became weapons, and the damage was permanent, and control became the defining feature in his relationships. And girlfriends from those early years would later describe him as possessive and domineering, because when a young woman tried to end things with Paul, Paul responded by violently destroying her things in a fire. Can't imagine why she broke up with you, Paul. That's crazy. But this behavior only intensified with time, and by his early 22nd, a clear pattern started to emerge, cause Paul was everything a partner could want at the start. He was attentive and generous and charming, what we would call now love bombing, and he impressed the families and warmed up to them, playing the role of the ideal boyfriend with precision. But once he felt secure in the relationship, once he believed he had control, the abuse would start and he'd humiliate them in public. Then he'd escalate his aggression in bed, and then the relationships would become more and more violent, and he'd threaten to kill them if they ever told people about the abuse. And some of the women he dated had the courage to go to the police, thank goodness, and restraining orders were filed, but still nothing stopped him. So Paul's understanding of women was built entirely around domination. He was never looking for a partner. He only wanted someone to control. And during his university years, he shared fantasies with friends that went far beyond troubling, including the verge and farm fantasy, which he described to his friend Van initially as a, quote, stockpile of women that he wanted to have sex with him, unquote, but eventually became a place that he would breed virgin girls to rape. Fucking disgusting. So he spoke about women as though they were objects. And our friend Alex Sassmeyer Ennis mentioned that Paul, quote, preferred women who were petite, small, and not too bright, unquote. And also said that he, quote, often had 2 or more girls on the go at the same time, unquote. So his real-world behavior grew increasingly more violent, and he demanded total submission during sex, getting pleasure from causing pain. So he's a sadist, and he'd refer to himself as the king and expected his partners to treat themselves as servants, and their fear and their discomfort and their suffering excited him. But to the outside world, Paul appeared to be succeeding. After finishing his degree, he landed a position as a junior accountant at a respected firm, and he dressed well and spoke with confidence, and invested heavily in his image, and he bought all sorts of self-improvement and get-rich materials, implementing them at his job and at bars when he would try out new pickup techniques. But behind the image, he had already become a predator, and before Karla ever entered his life, Paul had been attacking women, and not just the ones he was dating. Young women, teenage girls. He stalked them after dark, often near bus stops and quiet neighborhoods, and he used a knife to make them cooperate. And during the assaults, he talked constantly demanding specific words from his victims, just a total incomplete submission from them. Because control alone wasn't enough for him, he needed absolute domination. And at a local bar one evening, an acquaintance recalled that he even, quote, started talking about committing the perfect murder and, quote, if you were ever to kill someone unwanted, to dispose of the body, cut the body up, put it in cement and drop it in the river, unquote. That is what Paul would say to this acquaintance. So by day, he played the part of an ambitious young professional, but by night he prowled the same Scarborough streets where he had grown up. So Paul and Karla first crossed paths in October of 1987 at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough, and Karla was there for a pet convention, and she was 17 and Paul was 23, and the attraction between them was immediate, and within hours of meeting they were alone in a hotel room, and by the time the night ended they had slept together. But unlike Paul's usual routine, he didn't disappear afterward, and he actually kept in touch. And to Karla, all seemed like everything she had been waiting for. He was older and successful, and he had money and spent it freely, making her feel chosen. And she'd later say that she knew almost immediately that she was going to marry him. And to Paul, Karla represented something he had never encountered before. She was young and eager, but most importantly, she was receptive. Other women backed away from his darker impulses, but Karla didn't resist. She leaned in, validating him. She participated willingly. Just a couple of fucking psychopath monsters. Because Paul had spent years learning how to identify women who might embrace domination. And in Karla, he found a partner. And by the time their lives became intertwined, Paul was already a dangerous man living two lives. But now, for the first time, he wouldn't be operating alone. So the relationship between Paul and Karla outwardly looked like a whirlwind romance. They became inseparable almost from the moment they met, and Paul drove hours to see her, and Karla rearranged her entire life to accommodate him. And Paul played his part flawlessly, paid attention to her, showered her with gifts, took her to upscale restaurants, and spoke to her as though she were the only woman in the world, love bombing. And Karla gave herself over to him completely, and she described a perfect relationship in letters to her friends saying, quote, "Paul and I are happier than ever. He's being so great, so romantic, but that's typical of my honey," unquote. But there were no red flags in her own telling. She was all in. And early in the relationship, Paul even asked her, quote, what would she think if he was a rapist? "There's no red flags there, Karla. Okay, you fucking monster." And she would think it was cool. I have no words on. And according to one account, he started to assay women earnest after that conversation. But the relationship continued progressing quickly, and the two were engaged on December 24th, 1989. And the Ham aka family saw nothing alarming either, cause Paul was always polite when he came around, charming not only Karla but all of them as well, and he fit right into their family gatherings seamlessly. But what none of them could see was how quickly affection had already begun to turn into something else. And behind closed doors, things changed quickly. Paul introduced violence into their sex life almost from the beginning, framing it as exploration, and Karla went along with it willingly, even enthusiastically at times. And Paul documented what they did together, and he took pictures of their acts, and Karla happily posed for them, and none were taken without her awareness or consent. Note that she consented to all of this and was enthusiastic about that all right. And one picture in particular showed the two intimate while he strangled her with a rope and held a knife to her head. And Stephen Williams, author of Invisible Darkness, describes, quote, Karla handcuffed on her knees and begging for him, was scratching an itch, unquote. And friends of Karla's discovered handcuffs in her bedroom, and when they asked about them, she casually explained that Paul enjoys playing games in bed. And the violence only escalated from there, and Paul allegedly began hitting Karla during arguments in addition to during sexual encounters. So his need for control bled into every corner of her life, dictating what she wore, how she styled herself, what she ate, and how she behaved. And he constantly insulted her, calling her ugly and fat. And Karla absorbed those insults, even writing them down, so no, I don't obviously agree with him calling her those names, and I feel bad that he called her those names, but I'm not letting her off just because she stayed in this relationship, and we're gonna get into it more. But I'm gonna let you paint your own picture of what's going on, all right. But she would treat these insults like instructions rules for how to stay in his good graces. And she even wrote a self-improvement list, quote, be a perfect girlfriend for Paul, remember you're stupid, remember you're ugly, remember you're fat. I don't know why I tell you these things, because you never change, unquote. Very sad, very sad. But also I don't feel bad for her, because what she's gonna do and I don't know. And because Karla never tried to leave, she didn't go to the police or confide in friends or family, she just adapted her behavior to meet his expectations. And it wasn't in a Stockholm Syndrome type way, because I do have empathy for women that are stuck in relationships like that and they actually think those things about themselves and they feel like they can't get out. This is not the same thing, let me make that so very clear, okay? There might be a tiny little small element of that, but that does not rid her of the things that she will commit. Because Karla was not passive and she absolutely was not helpless, and in other areas of her life she remained confident and assertive. So the relationship was abusive, no question, but it was not a simple dynamic of predator and prey. The motivation and participation seemed to run in both directions. So as the relationship grew stronger, Karla noticed something Paul paid special attention to, and that was Tammy, her younger sister. He was always watching her and finding excuses to be near her. And Paul later confirmed that his attraction to Tammy quote-unquote began in July of 1990. So that summer his demands escalated, and he told Karla he wanted to have sex with Tammy. And Karla would later testify that she was quote totally against the idea unquote. Bombastic side, I own Karla right now and you'll understand that later on. But she claimed Paul threatened her and hit her and wore her down over time. There is nothing you could do to me that would force me to let you do something to my sister. You would have to kill me before that happened. So shut the fuck up, Karla, I'm getting angry in this one. I'm sorry, I'm getting angry in this one. Cause the evidence tells a completely different story. Also, Paul's obsession with Tammy would deepen and he started looking through Tammy's bedroom window. He would enter her room at night to masturbate. While she slept in, Karla even helped by breaking the windows in her sister's room to give him access monster. But Paul's focus was singular, and that was virginity, as Karla wasn't a virgin when they met and he never let her forget it, and he called her used goods. And in his mind, this meant that Karla owed him something, and she had taken something from him, and now she needed to give it back. And he would actually make her wear Tammy's clothes during their sexual encounters and had her say specific things like, "My name is Tammy, I'm 15 years old, you're virgin and I want to marry you." This and it just gets its just if there wasn't already a trigger warning. I apologize, here's a trigger warning like it should, it will just get worse from here. But for a sister to be okay with that and to stay in a relationship with someone that is willing to just put their own sister in the situation, it makes me ill, it makes me sick to my stomach. But that resentment eventually turned into a demand, and so Karla agreed to give Paul what he wanted, and she promised him her sister as a gift to satisfy him and secure the relationship. And Paul insisted Tammy would never know, that it'd be brief and no real harm would come from it, and she believed him. And Karla later framed her reasoning as a way to minimize risk and take control and keep it all in the family instead of allowing Paul to seek out other young girls who might expose him. So she's protecting him by letting him rape her, instead of letting him get exposed, instead of reporting him before he can do anything to anybody else. So yeah, you're equally the monster, Karla. And criminal profiler Candace Scrapp, I see, offered a different interpretation, and like myself, she believed Karla was a malignant narcissist who couldn't handle her fiancé's attraction to her younger sister. Ding ding, we have a winner, and her solution was simple: remove Tammy from the equation, and Karla chose to prioritize her relationship with Paul over her sister's safety. But the first attempt came months before the final plan was set in July of 1990. They made a spaghetti dinner for Tammy and laced it with Valium. Karla had taken from her workplace, and while Tammy was sedated, Paul did saw her for roughly a minute, and it was only a minute, because the meds weren't strong enough and she started waking up and they had to stop then. But they didn't abandon the idea fully. They just knew they had to get stronger meds now. So Karla went back to the Martindale Animal Clinic in St. Catharines and stole a bottle of halothane, which is a liquid general anesthetic designed for use on animals, and it's been described as, quote, twice as potent as chloroform and 4 times as potent as ether, unquote. She also secured a supply of halcyon, a strong sedative, by filling a fraudulent prescription. So, as someone who worked with these drugs, Karla understood what she was handling, and she understood what she was about to put in her sister's body, and she knew the potency in the drugs and the risks, yet she moved forward anyway. And Paul chose the night himself, December 23rd, 1990, quote, "This is the day I want to do this," unquote. He would tell Karla, and, quote, "It would be a great Christmas present for me," unquote. Just chills in the worst way. So they would invite Tammy down to the basement while the whole family slept, just days away from Christmas, and they would drug Tammy, and Paul would have his way with her. As to Paul, this was something he had earned, something Karla owed him. So the two of them made their preparations without any second thoughts, and the drugs were secured and the video camera was ready, and Tammy, now just over a week away from turning 16, suspected nothing. So December 23rd, 1990 began like any other holiday gathering at the Homolka household. The Christmas decorations were already up in the house, hummed with conversation, with everyone preparing for their favorite time of year, and the whole family was there that evening. Carolyn, Dorothy, Lori, Karla, and Karla's fiancé, Paul had brought his new video camera, and he recorded the scene as it unfolded. Mr. and Mrs. Homolka, the 3 daughters, the tree, and the decorations. And as the party wound down, and It started getting late. Carol and Dorothy headed upstairs to bed and Lori would do the same, but Karla encouraged Tammy to stay up a little longer. They could watch a movie together, just the three of them in the basement rec room. And throughout the evening, Karla and Paul kept Tammy's glass full of rum and eggnog, and they would just hand it to her casually like it was nothing, and what it was nothing. And what Tammy didn't know was that her drinks had been spiked with crushed halcyon, and Tammy had no reason to feel afraid. She was in her own home. She felt the safest she ever felt, surrounded by the people she trusted most, and she had no way of knowing that trust would be used against her. So the drug's effects began to take hold, and combined with the alcohol Tammy had been consuming throughout the evening, it completely knocked her out unconscious, so she slumped onto the basement couch. So everything was unfolding exactly as Karla and Paul had planned, and that's when Karla went to grab the halothane she had stolen, because it's supposed to be given using a vaporizer, inserting a breathing tube and keeping resuscitation equipment nearby in case of emergency. That's how serious this drug is. But of course, she disregarded all of those protocols, and instead she soaked a cloth in liquid anesthetic and pressed it directly against her younger sister's face. And both Paul and Karla would essa her, and they would also record it, passing the camera back and forth between them and upstairs. The rest of the Homolka family slept through it all, and no one heard anything out of place, and no one came downstairs to check. And at some point during the assault, Tammy would stop breathing, in moments after they finished, Tammy started vomiting, as she was still unconscious, and the sedatives and the anesthetic had numbed her reflexes, so she tried to breathe, but only managed to draw vomit down into her lungs. So Karla and Paul would scramble to bring her back, and Karla would try the same technique used at the vet clinic, holding her sister upside down in an attempt to clear the blockage from her throat, but nothing helped, cause Tammy was too drugged and she would not wake up. And the vomiting, as Dr. Ray Matthews, an anesthesiologist, later said in testimony, was most likely a direct result of the halothane exposure, and her pharmaceutical guidebook later recovered from the Bernardo residence explicitly identified nausea and vomiting as a known side effect of the drug. And on top of that, Tammy had been on her period that evening. Unmenstruating women face elevated risks of post-anesthetic vomiting, a fact that someone with that Karla's veterinary background may have been aware of. As if all of this wasn't horrid enough, so Karla understood that halothane was a high-risk substance, and she knew full well that it required specialized equipment to be used safely, and she knew what could happen with those precautions. And among the documented outcomes of halothane overdoses, death and what Paul and Karla had treated as just a quick thing had become final quote-unquote no real harm, had become the ultimate harm. But they did not call 911, at least not right away, and they didn't rush upstairs to alert her parents or Lori, and their attention turned almost immediately to self-preservation, because they're raging, sadistic, narcissistic psychopaths, and saving Tammy was no longer their concern. The only priority was saving themselves. I'd like to take a moment to talk about what's on my body clothes, and sometimes it's hard to figure out what to put on your body in this case, clothes, but something super fun that has helped me a lot lately is Daily Look. And for those of you who don't know, Daily Look is the know. One high, a straighted premium personal styling service for women, and here is why I have been obsessed lately. You get your own personal dedicated stylist, not an algorithm, an actual person. Crazy concept, right? And you get the same stylist every single time, so they learn your body shape, your preferences, your lifestyle, and they send you a box of up to 12 hand-picked pieces to try on at home, and you keep what you love and you send back the rest, and shipping is free both ways. I wore one of my daily pick looks to record a video last week, and I've worn plenty of them in the past couple months, and I get dozens of comments on those specific videos asking where I get my outfits, and it's all thanks to Daily Look, cause they work with brands like Kate Spade, Good American Agag, and up-and-coming designers too, and with sizes from extra small up to 3X. So it's time to get your own personal stylist with Daily Look. So head to Daily Look. Come to take your style quiz and use code KEM for 55% off your first order. It's super fun and honestly super helpful, so go to Daily Look. Calm using code KEM at checkout, and thank you so much to Daily Look for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to it. So the assault most likely concluded sometime between 11:30 p.m. at midnight, but the call for the ambulance didn't go out until 1. So I'm leaving roughly an hour unaccounted for, and During that window, Paul and Karla worked. Quickly, they dressed Tammy's body, carried her from the recreation room to her basement bedroom, hid the tape, ran laundry, and cleaned up everything that they could. By the time they were finished, the basement told a different story than the one that had actually unfolded. Their own paramedics arrived at the house at 1:00 a.m. to find Tammy unresponsive, quote, all vital signs absent, unquote, in her pupils' work, woefully fixated, undilated, unquote, and they did what they could, inserting a breathing tube and connecting a heart monitor, and they delivered shocks to her heart at 1:00 a.m. again at 1:00 a.m. and once more at 1:00 a.m. But the monitor never registered anything beyond a flatline, and Tammy was rushed to St. Catherine's General Hospital, where she would be pronounced dead, without ever regaining consciousness. And Paul and Karla offered the same explanation to everyone who asked. Tammy had too much to drink, causing her to vomit in her sleep and stop breathing, and doctors initially accepted that explanation, and their own conclusion matched the story. And when investigators asked about the physical burn mark on Tammy's face, Paul had an answer ready. He said it was a carpet burn caused by dragging her across the floor while trying to save her life. So what was supposed to be a wonderful holiday celebration had now taken an unthinkable turn in Christmas past, filled with shock and grief. Tammy would be buried. And at the funeral, witnesses observed Paul standing beside the open casket, and they watched him stroke Tammy's body, but somehow no suspicion was on him. Or Karla and the household slowly returned to routine, carrying this immense weight without understanding its true cause. So Tammy Lynn Homolka died on Christmas Eve inside of her own home, surrounded by the people she believed she could trust, and for years, no one knew what really happened. So immediately following Tammy's death, no one questioned the story they had been told, and 3 months later, local coroner Joseph Rossowski made it official. The cause of death was recorded as, quote, asphyxia due to aspiration of stomach contents, quote, and the classification was accidental, case closed. In medical professionals determined that Tammy choked on her own vomit after drinking, just as the story was told, a tragic accident and nothing more. And the halothane that had been dissolved into her drinks was never detected, and the halothane that had been pressed against her face was never identified. And no criminal investigation followed, and no suspicion fell on Paul or Karla. No one seemed to question their involvement either. So the Homolkas were to bury their youngest daughter, believing a lie, and an incorrect determination of death in Carol was barely functional in the aftermath. And Dorothy moved through each day in a fog of disbelief, and together they buried Tammy at Victorian Lawns Cemetery in St. Catherine's, and the investigation ended almost as quickly as it had begun, and that by all appearances was supposed to be the end of it. But there were signs, questions that should have been asked, details that didn't quite fit in. The most glaring of them was the burn on Tammy's face, as on Tammy's face as on Christmas Eve morning. Police identification officer George O'Neill photographed Tammy's body in the morgue, and the images showed a large angry read mark covering nearly all of her left cheek, but the edges weren't soft, they were sharp, clearly an outline. That's not the kind of mark you'd expect from friction against carpet. But still, the police accepted Paul's explanation. But according to one account, the original police report suggests that neither O'Neill nor other officers fully believed the story, and they doubted that a perfectly healthy teenage girl had simply stopped breathing after drinking too much, and that the burn on her face was really caused by carpet. And yet no one pursued it further, and the officer who ultimately closed the file made a single note, quote, the source of the burn, like lesions about the face, remained unexplained, unquote, so he wrote it down, and then he closed the case anyway. It's infuriating. And the drugs in Tammy's system went undetected because no one thought to even look for them, and the preliminary toxicology screen came back clean because her death had been treated as accidental from the start. There was no reason to dig deeper. The burn told its own story. And years later, in 1993, Tammy's body was exhumed. Forensic pathologist Dr. Noel M. KallMeKris conducted a second autopsy and discovered traces of halcyon still present in her liver, kidneys, and intestines, evidence that had been missed entirely the first time around. And Dr. Vincent D. Mayo, chief medical examiner for Bexar County, Texas, reviewed the case in 2001, examining the morgue photographs of Tammy's face closely, and his conclusion was clear: the injury was not caused by carpet. The quote-unquote clearly demonstrated edges, demonstrated just means that they're clearly defined, he explained, indicated that halothane quote-unquote had pulled beneath Tammy's cheeks, suggesting a significant amount of the drug had soaked through the cloth and made sustained contact with her skin and the smaller lesions visible around her. Nose and mouth were consistent with a quote, a hand pushing the cloth against the face, unquote, and he further suggested that, quote, an expiring Tammy may have lain in this condition for some time, unquote. And Dr. David King, the pathologist who signed Tammy's second autopsy report, came to a similar conclusion, and he confirmed that halothane had caused the chemical burn and directly contradicted Karla's later testimony, quote, "You're not going to get halothane burn by waving a halothane-soaked rag several inches away from the skin," unquote, he would say. And as for the original ruling, asphyxiation due to aspiration of stomach contents de Mayo was blunt cord aspiration, is a bullshit diagnosis we never sign anybody out of here with that as the cause of death, as a finding it's meaningless, unquote, which again is infuriating that went through, but sadly none of V. This came to light at the time, and in 1991 every one of these threads were unpursued, and no one examined the circumstances with enough scrutiny to challenge the story that had been offered. So that lack of suspicion became self-perpetuating because the death had been classified as accidental, so no deeper investigation was ever launched, and because no investigation was launched, no evidence of wrongdoing was ever uncovered, and much of the physical evidence from that night was eventually disposed of undone extorting. Photo negatives were filed away and forgotten, much like the situation as a whole. So Paul and Karla faced no consequences whatsoever, and they resumed their lives. Almost immediately, Paul went back to his work and his routines, and Karla stayed by his side, and if anything, their relationship just grew stronger, which is fucking disgusting, cause what they had done together had forged a new kind of bond between them, a shared secret, a shared crime, and neither showed any visible sign of remorse. In less than 2 months after Tammy's death, Karla wrote a letter to a friend expressing frustration with her parents' mourning, saying, quote, "My father doesn't even want us to have a wedding anymore," unquote. She complained, quote, "Screw that we're having a good time. If he wants to sit at home and be miserable, he's welcome to. He's only worked a day since Tammy died. He's wallowing in his own misery," unquote. Just a beast of a woman. And some sources say they left willingly, and others say they were kicked out, but either way, they relocated to a rented bungalow in Port Dalhousie, and the fact that they were caught or even suspected just emboldened them, and the most terrible thing they had ever done had gone completely undetected because the system had believed their story and the world had moved on, and they had learned a dangerous lesson. They could get away with it. And according to author Stephen Williams, that lesson was put into practice almost immediately, and barely 3 weeks after Tammy's death, after they murdered Tammy, Paul abducted another girl during the weekend of January 12, 1991, and he would essa her while Karla watched, and afterward he abandoned her on a deserted road near Lake Gibson, and they referred to her as January Girl. And then on April 6, 1991, Paul targeted a 14-year-old girl who had been training for a local rowing team. A blonde woman waved at the girl from a parked car, catching her attention, distracting her just long enough for Paul to drag her into a nearby shrubbery and desk. Her and the blonde woman was, of course, Karla. So what happened to Tammy was only the beginning, and no one was paying attention. But before they had moved out, while the family was still deep in mourning, Paul and Karla recorded a video together, and they called it the Fireside Chat, and it was filmed in the basement recreation room, the same room where Tammy had suffered, and on camera, Karla admitted to Paul that she had enjoyed watching him rape her sister, and she told him she wanted to leave a rose at Tammy's gravesite. And then the filming moved to Tammy's bedroom, and Karla put on her dead sister's clothes, pretending to be Tammy, and she and Paul had relations on Tammy's bed. And during the recording, Karla pitched a new idea, and she suggested they begin abducting girls together and keep them as sex slaves, and Paul asked when they should start, and Karla responded, "This summer, because the wintertime is too hard there. Like this is like the epitome of evil, like I at the point of this recording, all this Epstein stuff is going on, and this is just like this is evil. Doesn't seem believable, but it is so prevalent and so just widespread. It makes me want to vomit. It is so sickening." So in 1991, there was a girl who moved within the same social circles as Karla, and she was someone Karla knew personally, someone who trusted her. Her identity has been shielded by court order, now referred to only as Jane Doe, so I will be referring to her as Jane Doe, and she was 15 years old at the time, the same age Tammy had been when she passed away, and like Karla, Jane worked at a pet shop, and They had met when Jane was just 13 and Karla was 6 years older, so to Jane, Karla seemed like just the kind of woman a young teenager might admire and want to emulate, and according to one account, Jane, quote, idolized the pretty older woman, unquote, but she had no idea who Karla really was. And despite their relationship seeming strong on the outside, Karla had fears that she was losing Paul to a woman he had recently met on a trip. So naturally her solution was to find another virgin and to present to him as a wedding gift for their upcoming special day, Karla. And Paul and Jane began spending more time together, though Jane was unaware that she had been identified as a target in Jane's mother. Mary Doe felt uneasy from the beginning, and she couldn't figure out why a grown married couple would take such an interest in a teenage girl so much younger than themselves, quote, where were their friends, unquote. She'd later ask, and Mrs. Doe tried to intervene, and she screened her daughter's phone calls and monitored the answering machine, and she did what she could to limit contact between Jane and the couple. And when Paul began giving Jane gifts her mother confronted him directly they didn't need his generosity. She told him they could afford to buy their daughter whatever she needed, and his reply unsettled her, and he said, quote, I like to give gifts to my girlfriends, unquote. And Jane was a teenager who still operated under the assumption that adults, especially familiar ones, could be trusted, so she spent time with Karla and Paul. Without suspicion, and to her, Karla was friendly, unwarm, and there was nothing about their interactions that suggested danger. So 3 weeks before Paul and Karla were scheduled to marry on June 7, 1991, Karla invited Jane over for a girls' night out, and afterward, she brought the teenager back to their house, and a familiar pattern began. Karla gave Jane drinks throughout the evening mixed with sedatives, the same method she used on Tammy 6 months earlier, and Jane trusted Karla and accepted the drinks willingly. And as the drugs took hold, Jane grew drowsy, and when she lost consciousness, Karla called for Paul, and his surprise wedding gift was ready, and together they and rest her and Karla said her first, and then Paul, and then again. They recorded the entire thing, and the videotapes captured later would show Karla glancing up at the camera during the assault, smiling and blowing kisses. There was zero evidence of hesitation or reluctance, and when the assault was over, Jane was allowed to regain consciousness, and she was returned to her normal surroundings as if nothing had happened. And the attack mirrored what had happened to Tammy in nearly every aspect, except that Jane survived, thankfully, but she had no idea what had occurred. Was unconscious, and Paul and Karla intended to keep it that way. So Jane woke up the following morning feeling sick, and so something felt wrong, but she didn't know why. The drugs had erased her memory entirely, so the friendship just continued, and Jane still believed Karla was someone she could trust in. She even accompanied Paul and Karla on a trip to Toronto in the weeks that followed, and then in August, Karla invited Jane back to the house once again for another sleepover, and they drugged her again. But this time with both halcyon and halothane, and just like with Tammy, something went wrong. Jane stopped breathing. Karla dialed 911 while Paul tried to resuscitate her, and this time it worked, and Jane started breathing again, and Karla called back to cancel the ambulance, telling the dispatcher that everything was all right and there was no follow-up, and the 911 call was never investigated, and Jane still had no idea what had happened to her. And in the weeks that followed, Jane remained close to Karla, close enough to be invited to their wedding. So on June 29, 1991, Jane attended Paul and Karla's ceremony at St. Mark's Anglican Church, and she watched them exchange vows, and she celebrated with them at the reception. And she had no idea that just 3 weeks earlier she had been drugged and violated by that very couple standing at the altar, and she had no idea that she was the wedding gift Karla had promised Paul, and she had no idea that somewhere across town Ivers were pulling pieces of another young woman from a lake. She was just smiling in photographs at the wedding, and she went home that night believing she had witnessed the beginning of a fairy tale, but she couldn't have been more wrong. So from the fall of 1991 through Christmas of 1990, she continued visiting Karla and Paul, quote unquote, usually every weekend, according to her later testimony. And the visits included ongoing sexual contact, and Jane told the court that Paul had made it clear, quote, if I didn't keep him happy, Karla wouldn't be happy, and I wanted to keep Karla happy, unquote. And at one point, Paul asked her to promise that he would be, quote, the first man she had sex with, unquote. And she agreed, having no idea that he had already violated that promise while she was unconscious. So in December, Karla tried to pressure Jane into having sex with Paul. While she was awakened, Jane refused and left the house, upsetting the relationship finally ended around Christmas of 1990 to when Jane told Paul she wasn't interested anymore, and he reacted with anger and she said, quote, he said he didn't want to see me. Again, unquote, and she walked away, still carrying confusion and discomfort. She couldn't fully name it at the time. No one understood how important her survival would become later. So Leslie Erin Mahaffey was born in Hamilton, Ontario on July 5th, 1976. She lived in Burlington, Ontario with her mother, her father, and her younger brother, Ryan, and her father, Robert. Ord and Mahaffey worked as an oceanographer for Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and the job took him away from home for stretches at a time, sometimes even weeks. And her mother, Debbie Mahaffey, was a teacher, and as a teenager, Debbie had undergone radiation treatment for ovarian cancer and had been told she would never conceive, so Leslie was a miracle baby, and she shared a close bond with her brother, and even during the times when she tested the limits or pushed back against her parents, their bond was strong. And she ran away on occasion, but she always called home and checked in with Ryan. And she was a grade 9 student at Robinson High School, and Leslie and her circle of friends recently were struggling with a sudden devastating loss for people close to her had been killed in a car accident. One of them was a boy named Chris Evans, and the weight of that tragedy hung over everything, and it would directly shape the events of the night to come. So on Friday, June 14th, 1991, Leslie attended a wake for Chris Evans at a local funeral home, and before she left, she promised her parents she would be back home by 11 p.m., but the night did not go as planned, and after the service ended, Leslie and a group of teenagers made their way into the woods, and they drank and they talked, and they leaned on each other as they tried to process the loss of their friend. And in the early morning hours, some of Leslie's friends walked home, and it was just before 2:00 a.m., so they waited while she checked the side door of the house. But it was locked, and Leslie assumed the front door would still be open, so she told her friends to go ahead, but the front door was locked too, and some sources say her parents had allegedly decided to teach her a lesson about missing curfew. So she walked to a Mac's Milk convenience store not far from her house and used the payphone to call a friend asking if she could come over and spend the night, but there was no answer. And now she was alone in the middle of the night with nowhere to go, but she headed back towards her house anyway. And that same night, Paul was cruising through Burlington neighborhoods, stealing license plates from parked cars, and he was looking for someone, and he spotted Leslie and approached her, and he told her he was trying to break into the house next door and offered her a cigarette, which was supposedly in his car, instant saying no danger because he was very charming and allegedly good looking. Or whatever, I think he's evil and fucking ugly in my head, but you know what? To a teenage girl, this attractive guy is coming up, and the red flags just weren't going off. So Leslie went towards the car, and when she got close enough, Paul wrapped his sweatshirt around her head, stuffed her in the car, and drove away with her. Paul would bring Leslie back to Karla at their place, and once inside, she was restrained, her hands bound with twine, and to keep her subdued, they used their typical method of sedatives that Karla got through work, just as they had with Tammy and Jane. And over the hours that followed, Leslie was assayed multiple times by both of them, and the videotapes found later on would show them both actively participating in this abuse, and at various points, Leslie cried out in pain, pleading with Paul to stop, and the music of Bob Marley and David Bowie played in the background. And at one point during her captivity, Leslie was handed a teddy bear to hold, which would seem like a weirdly genuine gesture were it not for the context of what was really occurring. And at another moment, Leslie told Bernardo that her blindfold was slipping, which meant that she might be able to see his face, and on a videotape, Paul is seen smiling directly into the camera, while in the background, where Leslie can be heard screaming. And throughout the ordeal, Leslie remained alive and conscious, fully aware of what was happening to her, and she endured for as long as she could. But unfortunately, Leslie would be murdered sometime on June 15th, 1991, less than a day after she had been taken, and both Paul and Karla would later point the finger at each other for her death, and Paul's version was that Karla gave Leslie a fatal dose of sedatives while he was elsewhere in the house preparing the car, and Karla's version was that Paul strangled Leslie with an electrical cord and left her unconscious, then returned and strangled her a second time. But the exact sequence of events in those final moments has never been definitively established, and what is certain is that by the end of the day, Leslie was no longer alive. And the following morning was Father's Day, and at some point Leslie's body was moved from the upstairs bedroom down to the basement, and that same afternoon the Homolka family arrived at the house for a Father's Day dinner, and they ate together on the main floor, laughing and talking, entirely unaware of what lay just beneath their feet. And throughout the gathering, Karla took special care to keep her mother from wandering downstairs, and after the family left, Paul went out and purchased a dozen bags of cement and saved the receipts, and using a circular saw that had belonged to his grandfather, they dismembered Leslie's body into 10 pieces, and those pieces were then encased in 8 concrete blocks, and over the course of multiple trips, Paul and Karla transported the blocks to Lake Gibson and dumped them in the water, but the heaviest one weighed over 200 pounds and proved to be difficult to lift, so it was left near the shoreline. So while Leslie's family searched frantically for any sign of their daughter, Paul and Karla turned their attention elsewhere because they had a wedding to plan. My heart breaks for that family. So on June 29th, 1991, a man named Michael Duke and his son Michael Jr. were paddling a canoe across Lake Gibson when the large slab of concrete with a torso in it caught their attention, and authorities were notified, and police divers entered the lake and recovered additional slabs, and they found more human remains connected to the blocks, and Leslie was identified through her dental records and the braces she had been wearing when she disappeared, and investigators examining the remains immediately suspected she had been subjected to a prolonged abuse before her death, and the discovery sent a wave of fear through Burlington and the surrounding communities, and parents were terrified because a teenage girl had been abducted, murdered, and discarded in pieces with no clue as to who was responsible, and Leslie would be laid to rest at Burlington Memorial Gardens, and in time her school would honor her memory with a heart-shaped garden and a plaque bearing her name, but the people who killed her still remained free, living as if nothing had happened. So Paul and Karla got engaged on December 24th, 1989, and that date fell exactly 1 year before Tammy was murdered. But at the time, no one had any reason to see it as anything other but a happy moment. And from the start, Paul made clear that the wedding would be no modest affair. He wanted something extravagant, so Paul apparently viewed the whole thing not just as a business opportunity, but a chance to collect substantial sums of money and gifts from guests, and the planning began early and moved forward with intensity, and the ceremony would take place at St. Mark's Anglican Church in Niagara on the Lake Ontario, and the reception would follow at Queen's Landing with a formal sit-down dinner for 150 guests featuring a veal-stuffed pheasant on the menu, and a white horse-drawn carriage was rented to transport the couple, costing $1,000, and Karla's wedding gown alone ran to $1,000 USD, and they estimated the wedding would bring in as much as $50,000 in gifts. So the date was locked on June 29th, 1991, just 6 short months after Tammy's death, and in the weeks leading up to the day, the violence surrounding the couple accelerated with Jane and Leslie. During this time, Karla reported expressed frustration that her parents were still consumed by grief over Tammy, and she felt they weren't giving the wedding enough attention that it deserved, so the contrast between her expectations and the weight of recent loss caused tension within the family naturally, but still, the wedding moved forward without delay. So when the big day finally arrived, Paul and Karla stood at the altar of St. Mark's Anglican Church and exchanged their wedding vows, and the church was full. A friends, family, and colleagues, 150 guests had gathered near Niagara Falls to witness what appeared to be the picture-perfect union, in photographs from the day capture the couple smiling side by side, radiating the energy that would later make the label Ken and Barbie impossible to shake, and every element of the ceremony had been carefully orchestrated as he did for the relationship in general. Paul controlled most of the decisions, the menu, Karla's hair, the phrasing. The vows, he insisted the traditional language include the words love, honor, and obey, and he rejected husband and wife, demanding instead that the officiant pronounce the man and wife in Patience by Guns N' Roses was to be their wedding song, and after the ceremony, they climbed into the rented white carriage and rode off together. So it looked like the final scene of a fairy tale storybook romance, reaching its inevitable joyful end, but not everyone remembered the moment that way, and some witnesses would later recall that Karla looked visibly unhappy as she sat beside Paul in the carriage, and others described her body language as stiffened. At the time, no one thought much of it, and the flowers Karla carried down the aisle, the bouquets held by her bridesmaids, had been dedicated to the memory of Tammy. The guests smiled, the couple kissed, the carriage rolled away, and somewhere across town police divers were searching for concrete blocks. So at the same moment that Paul and Karla were engaging vows, Leslie's body was being pulled from the water. Leslie had been dead for 13 days at this point. And for 2 weeks, her family had been searching, pleading for information, and hoping she had simply run away and would come home on her own as she had done in the past. But on the day of the wedding, they learned the truth, and while celebration took place at a nearby reception, Leslie's remains were being recovered and identified. Yet once again, not a soul suspected Paul and Karla, and they continued as planned, and Paul and Karla soon left for their honeymoon in Hawaii and Hawaii. Behind them, Niagara Regional Police lodged a homicide investigation with no suspects and no leads. So the wedding became the crowning achievement of the lie they had built, a flawless performance of youth, beauty, and dramatic success. Kristen Dawn French came into the world on May 10th, 1976 in St. Catharines, Ontario, and she was the second daughter born to Doug and Donna French, and Kristen had a brother, a family dog named Sasha, and two parents who made their children the center of their lives. And Donna described Kristen as, quote, sweet, gentle, happy Kristen, the sweetheart of the family, unquote. And by the time she was 15, Kristen had already built a kind of reliable reputation. She was a student at Holy Cross Catholic Secondary School, where she consistently made the honor roll, and her grades were straight A's, and teachers regarded her as responsible and focused, and friends knew her as someone who gave without hesitation. And when a classmate actually broke her leg, Kristen took it upon herself to bring home the girls' science and French homework. So that was Zoe's. Just the kind of person she was. She didn't seek recognition for helping others. She just helped because she believed it was the right thing to do. And Kristen was also a dedicated athlete, and she skated on a precision ice skating team that had earned several medals in competition, and she also rowed for her herd schoolgirls rowing team, pushing herself through grueling training sessions, and she managed the demands of school sports and social life masterfully. But on the afternoon of April 16th, 1992, Kristen French left school and started walking home, and it was Holy Thursday, the day before Good Friday and the start of Easter weekend in classes at Holy Cross. Secondary school had just let out, and students were spilling into the surrounding streets, heading off in different directions, and Kristen walked alone in near the entrance to the Grace Lutheran Church parking lot. Kristen crossed paths with Paul and Karla. The couple had spent the afternoon driving through St. Catharines during the hours when school was let out, actively hunting for a target, and when they spotted Kristen walking by herself, they pulled into the church lot and waited, and Karla stepped out of the car first, and she was holding a map, pretending to be confused and needing directions, and Kristen stopped to help as she always did. And that moment of kindness was the opening Paul needed, because that's when he came at her from behind and forced her into the vehicle at knife point. And once Kristen was inside, Karla held a blade to her throat and grabbed a fistful of her hair from behind, keeping her pinned down while Paul sped away from the lot. And this all happened in broad daylight in a public place with people near, by just highlighting their arrogance and their just narcissism and confidence in themselves. But some people saw this, and several witnesses noticed something was wrong, though they didn't understand what they were looking at in the moment. But one of Kristen's shoes was found lying in the parking lot afterward, which was evidence of a struggle, and by that evening Kristen French had been reported missing. So Kristen was held captive for 3 days from April 16th through to April 19th, 1992, and she remained inside Paul and Karla's house. But unlike the others that met a similar fate, Kristen was never drugged, and she was conscious for all of it. And Paul and Karla once again recorded what they did to her, and the footage shows them torturing saying her over the course of those 3 days, forcing her to drink a lot of alcohol. And in the recordings, Kristen is still wearing her Holy Cross school uniform, and her wrists are bound with handcuffs, and her ankles are tied with cordon. On the tapes, Paul can be heard telling Karla to perform certain acts, quote unquote, with force, reassuring her that, quote unquote, it's okay if it hurts, and Kristen could be heard crying out in pain. And the recordings also capture Karla laughing and enjoying herself, and the footage further contradicts the image of a woman who participated only because she was afraid and had no choice. Shut the fuck up, you monster. And to Paul, that goes without saying, but as we will see in the end in Karla's defense, she paints herself as something she is absolutely not, and that is innocent. So Kristen endured a longer captivity than any of the victims who came before her, and in the beginning she cooperated, believing compliance was her only path to survival. But as her cruelty escalated, something in Kristen shifted, and She started to push back, and at some point during those 3 days, she came to understand the reality of her situation, and she had seen their faces. She knew where they lived and had seen their dog, and she knew too much, and she understood. Was not going to be released, and still she resisted, and she is remembered for looking at Bernardo and telling him, quote, "Some things are worth dying for," unquote. She would also tell him, quote, "I don't know how your wife can stand to be around you," unquote, and Paul didn't like that at all, unfortunately. Kristen would be killed on Easter Sunday, April 19th. 1992, and according to Karla's account, Paul wrapped a black electrical cord around Kristen's neck and strangled her, and the autopsy would later confirm strangulation as the official cause of death, and the medical examiner also documented extensive injuries across her body consistent with days of sustained torture, and the murder itself was not captured on tape, but in the hours that followed, Karla testified that she styled her hair with a blow-dryer before leaving the house, and she and Paul went to her parents' home for Easter dinner, and later that night they loaded Kristen's body into their vehicle and drove approximately 50 kilometers to a secluded rural area near Burlington, Ontario, and they left her there discarded in the brush and turned back toward home still, suffering no consequences. So Kristen's body was found by a man named Roger Boyer as he was out driving in Burlington, and he saw something odd about 20 feet off the road, and after checking it realized there was a body, and he contacted authorities as quickly as he could, and they arrived shortly as investigators examined her remains. They noticed the tip of her little finger was missing, and that detail helped confirm her identity because Kristen had lost part of that finger years earlier during a rowing accident, and her head had been shaved completely and her body bore unmistakable signs of rape and prolonged physical abuse. So this discovery sent shock waves across Ontario again, and authorities made a public announcement saying they believed they were now dealing with a serial killer, and in response, police formed the Green Ribbon Task Force, a joint investigative unit dedicated to solving the murders of Leslie and Kristen, and at the same time, Kristen's classmates at Holy Cross began distributing green ribbons in her memory, and what started as a small gesture of grief eventually grew into a nationwide movement, and the Green Ribbon of Hope campaign created to raise awareness about missing and exploited children. Kristen would be buried at Pleasant View Memorial Gardens in Fonthill, Ontario, and a scholarship fund was established in her name, and on the day that should have been her 16th birthday, Kristen's rowing team competed in a race, and they had fallen behind early, trailing in last place. But in the final stretch, they said, they felt Kristen's spirit and flew forward, crossing the finish line first, and they gave their medals to Doug and Donna French, and Kristen would never have the chance to turn 16, and she would never row another race or help another classmate, but she would never be forgotten. So for years, investigators had been hunting a predator they couldn't identify, and the search began in November of 1988 after a wave of brutal sexual assaults swept through Toronto's east, and the Metropolitan Police assembled a dedicated task force to track down the man the media had dubbed the Scarborough Rapist. At its height, the unit included 50 officers, but over the course of the investigation, more than 41,000 tips poured in from the public, but none of them lead to an arrest, and the predator remained a ghost. And then in 1990, the attack stopped, and there was no explanation and no capture. But by 1991, the task force was quietly dissolved, and the unspoken assumption among investigators was that the danger had passed and whoever was responsible had moved on or been incarcerated for something else or simply stopped offending. But that assumption was wrong, and the man behind the Scarborough rapes just relocated, and in St. Catharines, the nature of his crimes had changed because the violence had gone from assault to murder. And in the wake of Kristen's abduction and killing in April of 1990, Niagara Regional Police reached out to the FBI for assistance, and within weeks, 5 criminal profilers from the Bureau's Behavioral Analyst Unit traveled north to consult on the case, and the assessment was direct. The perpetrator was a sexually motivated predator, and unless he was caught, he would almost certainly kill again. And by mid-May, investigators formed the Green Ribbon Task Force, a joint unit dedicated to solving both murders, and by this point, investigators understood they were pursuing a serial offender, and the geography alone pointed to a pattern. Both abductions and body disposals had occurred along the same stretch between St. Catharines and Burlington, so the murders of Leslie and Kristen bore undeniable Similarities in method and victim selection, but what no one had yet pieced together was the connection that would eventually break the case wide open. The Scarborough rapist and the killer of those girls were the same person in the Toronto investigation, and the Niagara investigation continued to operate independently, totally unaware they were looking for the same person or sentence, as we know. The Scarborough predator had been a figure without a face for quite some time, and he had attacked his victims from behind, so most never got a clear look at tear look. Him and the descriptions that trickled in were vague and difficult to act on. Then, in May of 1991, Survivor changed everything she had seen her attacker's face and remembered it. So, working from her description, police developed a computer-generated composite portrait, and on May 28, 1990, the sketch appeared in newspapers across the region, and the headline read, quote, "Is this boy next door? The Scarborough rapist on," quote. The image depicted a man with light blue eyes and blonde hair, medium build and clean shaven, and alongside the sketch, investigators announced a $150,000 reward for any information, leading to an arrest. And the public responded immediately, and within weeks more than 16,000 tips flooded in, and among them was the same name, Paul Bernardo. And former colleagues at Price Waterhouse recognized the face in the composite, and one co-worker brought the newspaper into the office and remarked openly sketch looked just like him. And meanwhile, fear had seeped into daily life across the city. Women stopped walking alone after dark, and one woman later recalled standing at a bus stop when a man passed by and said casually, quote, "You should be careful, I could be the Scarborough rapist," unquote. So fucked up, but the warning signs had been there for years, and the clues pointing to Paul had come up time and time again, only to be overlooked, deprioritized, or lost in the flood of incoming tips. And as far back as May 1988, an ununiformed officer conducting surveillance near a bus shelter noticed a man crouched beneath a tree watching and waiting, and the officer chased the man, but the man got away, and the man was Paul. And one of Paul's former girlfriends named Jennifer had contacted police on multiple occasions to report him of violence and abuse, and reports were made, but nothing came of them. And there were other details that should have been noticed, like the Scarborough predator was known to drive a white Capri, and Paul owned a white Capri, and he lived right next to the areas where the attacks had occurred, and his appearance matched the physical profile investigators had developed. And in June of 1990, a bank employee who had worked with Paul saw the composite sketch in a newspaper and immediately recognized him, and she reported him to the police. And later, in the summer, Tina Esmeyer N. is the wife of one of Paul's closest friends, reached out to investigators with her own suspicions, and she and her husband, Alex, told detectives that Paul had previously been questioned in connection with a rape, mentioning that he frequently discussed his aggressive sexual preferences in disturbingly explicit terms. And in May of 1990, to another acquaintance named John Modell went to authorities and identified Paul as a potential suspect, so his name kept rising to the surface, and every time it sank back down somehow. And despite the repeated tips from all sorts of people, Paul managed to avoid suspicion in the investigation far too long. But his time was finally coming. I'd like to take a moment to talk about something that freaked me out not too long ago, and that is that someone I know looked myself up online and found my address, my phone number, and even some of my family members' information just sitting there for anyone to find. And that's because thousands of data brokers collect and sell your personal information without you ever knowing, and it's scary. And that's how scammers craft those eerily specific phishing texts and calls they're buying your data, but Incognito steps in and contacts these brokers on your behalf. So thank you so much to Incognito for supporting this channel and sponsoring this video, and they do this by requesting they delete your information. So they handle the back and forth so you don't have to, and with their new custom removals feature on the Unlimited and Family Unlimited plans, you can actually point Incognito to any specific site where your info is showing up, and their privacy agents take care of the rest. So protect yourself and go to Incognito.com/KallMeKris and use code KallMeKris for 60% off. So take your data back and protect yourself and go to Incognito.com/KallMeKris. Thank you so much to Incognito for supporting the channel and sponsoring the video, and let's get back to it. So after all the tips had continued to fly, and detectives finally sat down with him for an interview in July, and a second conversation took place in November, lasting just 35 minutes. And when asked why he believed police had contacted him, Paul offered a casual explanation, acknowledging that he bore a resemblance to Ruse, the composite sketch, and he laughed about it. and he agreed to provide biological samples for DNA comparisons, and the detectives that interviewed him came away impressed, right, because he didn't match their expectations, saying, quote, "Such a well-educated, well-adjusted, congenial young man couldn't be responsible for these vicious crimes," unquote. What about Ted Bundy had happened? We just not really just cause somebody's attractive and can speak words, okay, doesn't mean they can't fucking hurt people, but they found him far more credible than Alex Smirnoff, the tipster who had reported him, who struck them as awkward and unreliable. So Paul walked out the interview a free man, and his DNA samples were submitted to the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto, with more than 130 other samples collected during the investigation. And at the time, forensic DNA testing was still in its infancy in Canada, and the lab responsible for processing the evidence employed just one scientist and one technician, and initial screening narrowed the pool to 5 samples, including polls that matched the blood factors of the Scarborough Predator. But by then, the Scarborough Predator case had lost its urgency, and Paul's DNA sat in a queue for 26 months, untouched and untested, and during those 26 months, Stammy, Jane, Leslie, and Kristen would all be horrifically abused, crimes that could have been prevented had his DNA been processed sooner. The evidence that would have identified him had been sitting in a lab the entire time. Incredibly frustrating and just horrific to think about those poor girls. So a sample was flagged for more comprehensive testing and resubmitted in April of 1990. So by that year, the carefully constructed image surrounding Paul and Karla had started to crack, cause things still appeared intact from the outside, but inside the house the reality was something else entirely, and the dynamic between them had deteriorated, and the man Karla would later describe as charming, attentive, and romantic during their courtship had transformed into someone unrecognizable as he grew more controlling and more volatile and more demanding, and whatever balance had once existed between them had now fallen apart, tipping decisively in his favor. And Karla would later tell investigators that everything changed after December of 1990 and Tammy died, and according to her account, Paul began wielding Tammy's death as a weapon, threatening to expose the truth of what had happened that night if Karla ever tried to leave, and she claimed he manipulated her, intuited, participating in criminal acts, that he trapped her in a relationship defined by sex, physical violence, and emotional abuse, and yet she stayed, and she continued writing Bernardo affectionate letters, and she continued indulging in his sexual fantasies, and she continued helping him commit crimes. So that contradiction between the helpless victim and the willing participant captured on video would sit at the center of everything that followed. And come summertime, allegedly the abuse grew worse against Karla, where Paul began using Karla as a regular target for his rage. His grip on control was loosening, and the marriage became dangerous. And in June, Karla decided she wanted out, and she reached out to her parents and asked them to help her move her belongings out of the Port d'Hucy house. And when Carol and Dorothy arrived, the scene was tense, and Dorothy would later testify that Karla appeared distraught while Paul was drunk and belligerent. And as Karla's things were being loaded into the van, Paul asked her to step inside the house to talk, and she agreed and went in alone. A minute later, she came back outside and told her parents that she and Paul would be able to settle things between them, so she stayed yet again self-preservation. But the reconciliation attempt was short-lived, and by January of 1993, the violence was too much, and Paul attacked Karla with a heavy metal flashlight and stabbed her with a screwdriver, and he beat her repeatedly around the head and limbs with force so severe that she developed raccoonitis, a condition caused by her brain being driven forward against the inside of her skull. And Karla arrived at the emergency room at St. Catherine's General Hospital with 2 blackened eyes and a wrist that appeared to be broken, and she could barely walk in a straight line and had difficulty recognizing where she was. And when the hospital staff asked what had happened, she told them she had been in a car accident, and she was treated and then released. And on January 4th, Karla returned to her work, and she told them the same story, but her co-workers weren't buying it. And shortly after, anonymous phone calls began reaching Dorothy Homolka. The next day, Dorothy drove to the clinic and saw her daughter's face with her own eyes, and she would later testify about that moment, saying, quote, "I shook, I couldn't understand what was happening," unquote, and she wanted to bring Karla home immediately, but not without pushback. So in the days that followed, Karla's parents pushed harder, and they convinced her to take shelter at the home of one of Lori's friends, whose husband happened to be a police officer in Toronto, and when Karla's parents arrived to grab her belongings, she broke away from them and ran back inside, moving frantically through the house searching for something, and when she finally emerged, her hands were empty and she left reluctantly, visibly unsettled, and investigators would later come to believe she had been looking for the videotapes, the damning evidence that she was an active participant in all the horrid crimes that she did. And on January 6th, Karla was formally admitted to St. Catharines General Hospital for treatment of her injuries. At this time, she filed charges as a battered spouse, and Paul was arrested and charged with assault with a weapon, only to be released on bail shortly afterward. And eventually she relocated to Brampton, moving in with her aunt and uncle, but the cracks in the facade were spreading fast. And on February 9th, Karla sat for an interview with the Metro onto sexual assault squad, and their initial assumption was that she was simply a victim. And that night, Karla told her aunt and uncle that Paul was the Scarborough predator and that the two of them had been involved in the essayant murder of Leslie and Kristen, and that they recorded it. So on February 1st, just before Karla's interviews, the long wait finally came to an end, and at the Center of Forensic Sciences, Toronto technicians completed DNA analysis on a blood sample Paul had voluntarily provided more than 2 years earlier, and this time, the results left no room for interpretation. The DNA was a match and seam unrecovered from victims of the Scarborough predator corresponded directly to Bernardo's genetic profile, and conclusively Paul Bernardo was the Scarborough predator, and the evidence tied him to at least 3 confirmed essays where biological samples had been preserved, and investigators grasped the implications immediately, and the delay had given Paul all the time he needed to continue living freely and let the violence evolve into something far worse. And police moved quickly to make up for lost ground, and Paul was placed under round-the-clock surveillance, and his movements were tracked and his phone lines were tapped, and the man who had slipped through the law enforcement's grasp for years was finally being watched. And when Detective Steve Irwin, not that Steve Irwin, uncovered that Paul had recently been charged with assault by his own wife in St. Catharines, the scattered pieces of the investigation clicked into place for the first time. The Scarborough predator, the murders, the domestic violence complaint, they were one continuous story. And when Karla was brought in for questioning, she understood what police had pieced together, and now they were looking at her, and detectives asked her to provide fingerprints, and they asked about a Mickey Mouse wristwatch that had been recovered from the house, one bearing a striking resemblance to a watch Kristen had been wearing the day she disappeared, and Karla became afraid, and in the days that followed, she began swallowing large quantities of painkillers, chasing them with alcohol, trying to dull a terror that had become very real because the walls she had helped build were closing in around her. So when Karla finally started talking, she spoke as someone who had been victimized. She presented herself as a woman who had spent years living under the thumb of a violent, controlling man, that she described Paul as manipulative and domineering, and she said he had beaten her, threatened her, and dictated every detail of her daily existence. And she also mentioned that Paul bragged about raping as many as 30 women, which was twice as many as suspected, and placed the blame for her sister Tammy's death solely on Paul. And she told police that what happened to Tammy was all his doing, and over the course of a 4-day interrogation, Karla constructed a narrative in which she had no choice, and she acknowledged knowing about the Scarborough assaults, and she acknowledged knowing about the murders of Leslie and Kristen, and she acknowledged being present when those crimes were committed, and she acknowledged playing a role in carrying them out, but at every turn she minimized her own involvement, and investigators listened as she told her story, and as the hours passed, they began to see the full scope of what lay before them, the warped dynamic between the two people at the center of all the crimes. So on February 11th, 2 days after her police interview, Karla met with George Walker, a defense attorney based in Niagara Falls, and Walker's objective was clear: secure legal immunity from the Crown in exchange for Karla's testimony. And 3 days later, on February 14th, Walker sat down with Crown Prosecutor Murray Segal. And when Walker mentioned the existence of the videotapes, Segal said that full immunity was off the table, but a reduced sentence could be arranged, and discussions continued, and over the following days, the framework of an agreement emerged, and Karla was presented with a plea bargain, and she had 1 week to decide. Under the terms of the deal, she would be required to cooperate fully, providing what prosecutors described as a full and complete truthful account of The deaths of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey and Tammy Homolka, and she would testify against Paul and plead guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter rather than Anne. Murder in return, she would receive a 12-year sentence, and if she refused, she would face 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and additional charges. And at the time, prosecutors operated under 3 key assumptions. First, that Karla Homolka was a battered woman, and second, that Paul was the dominant offender of the crimes, and third, that without Karla's testimony, obtaining a conviction against Paul for the murders would be extraordinarily difficult. And it is important to note that they had not yet seen these videotapes. Like during the point of the deal, like the videotapes are damning like she is a fucking monster, but all they're getting is her testimony at this point, so I don't know why they would make this deal without receiving the videotapes and how. I'm a YouTuber, what the fuck would I know? But that is the giant grain of salt that is being given to the prosecutors at this point. So when Crown prosecutors signed Karla Homolka's plea agreement on May 14th, 1993, they were operating essentially blinded. They had Karla's version of the events, and they had heard testimony about being a battered wife coerced into participation, and they had the physical evidence of Paul's abuse, but they did not have the tapes that would show Karla laughing during the assaults, and the tapes that would show her initiating acts of violence, and the tapes that would reveal her as an enthusiastic participant and not a reluctant victim. And those tapes were hidden above a bathroom light fixture, exactly where Paul had left them. Ken Murray, Paul's defense attorney, would retrieve them just 8 days before the plea deal was finalized, and he watched them, and he made copies, and he said nothing, no words. For 17 months, the prosecution built its case around a narrative that the tapes would have completely destroyed by the time the truth emerged. It was too late, the deal was done, and there was no taking it back. So the deal moved forward. Regardless, and the Crown found itself with a dilemma. The DNA evidence was strong enough to prosecute Paul for the Scarborough assaults, but there was no concrete evidence to tie him to the murders other than Karla's testimony, and the only real path to a murder conviction came directly through her testimony, and a later government inquiry would say, quote, the Crown had no alternative but to negotiate with an accomplice, and quote, it was in the inquiries assessment the lesser of 2 evils to strike a deal with a participant in the crimes rather than risk letting a violent predator escape accountability. Altogether, the media would eventually give the agreement a different name, and they called it the deal with the devil, which I fully agree with the media for once in real life. So years later, prosecutors involved in the case would acknowledge what many had long suspected had they seen the videotapes before finalizing the agreement. The agreement never would have signed it. So on February 17, 1993, Paul was taken into custody, and officers from Metro onto a sexual assault squad, and the Green Ribbon Task Force made the arrest together, and he was charged in connection with the Scarborough assaults and formally identified as the prime suspect in the murders of Leslie and Kristen. So investigators secured a search warrant for his house, but the warrant came with severe limitations. His police were restricted to seizing only those items explicitly named in the document. Any videotapes discovered during the search had to be watched inside the house, and officers were forbidden from conducting destructive searches, so no tearing open walls, no pulling down ceilings, no dismantling fixtures. So the search stretched on for 71 days, and they found damning evidence, a handwritten list cataloging every one of the Scarborough's essays and books on pornography, sexual deviation, and serial murder, and videos exploring similar subject matter, a hunting knife, handcuffs, and they also recovered a videotape depicting Paul and Karla engaged in sexual acts with 2 young women, who 2 young women had not been previously identified, and one of the women appeared to have been drugged, and the other seemed unaware of what was happening to her. But the tapes believed to document the murders themselves were nowhere to be found, and police searched the house for more than 2 months but never found them. But in the meantime, the legal process continued on, and on May 18th, 1993, Karla appeared in court and was formally arraigned on 2 counts of manslaughter, and on July 6th, 1993, Karla entered her guilty plea and was sentenced to 2 12-year terms to be served concurrently, so the Crown had secured its star witness, and the prosecution of Paul Bernardo could now move ahead. But investigators were still unaware of just what was on the missing tapes, evidence that would prove Karla was no passive victim and would make the plea deal that much more controversial. So for 71 days, investigators had combed through every corner of Paul's place, but came up empty, and Paul was the only person who knew exactly where they were. From his jail cell, he wrote a page letter to his defense attorney, Ken Murray, including a hand-drawn diagram to find the hiding spot, and he told Ken to retrieve the tapes, but do not watch them yet, and if Murray succeeded, he was to say, quote, how about those Jays, unquote, and if he failed, he was to say, how about those Leafs, unquote, and Murray entered the house bringing his junior counsel Carol and McDonald and the law clerk, and the place was in ruins. Rotting food had been left in the kitchen cosmetic containers. Worse, scattered and emptied in the upstairs bathroom was still in disarray, bearing the marks of a police search that had stretched on for weeks, and Murray went directly to the bathroom, reaching above the pot lightened. He pulled out 6 videotapes. How this is aloud, I will never know, and McDonald would later describe what she observed in the moment, saying, quote, I can see his leg vibrating, shaking a mile a minute, unquote, and Murray believed he had uncovered a bonanza for the defense, and he transported the tapes back to his office and secured them inside a safe. In 12 days later, acting on Paul's written instructions, Murray watched the tapes, and he made a duplicate copy and stored it in a separate secure location, and then he held on to the originals for 17 months, and the strategy was simple: allow Karla to testify at the preliminary hearing presenting the battered wife narrative, then release the tapes to destroy her credibility on the stand. Just evil. He reveled their evil, he reveled fucking everywhere. But the prosecution bypassed the preliminary hearing altogether and proceeded directly to trial, so Murray's plan fell apart, and by the summer of 1990, for he found himself with a serious ethical crisis, he sought counsel from his own attorney, who in turn consulted the Law Society of Upper Canada, and he was instructed to seal the tapes and surrender them to the trial judge, and in September, Murray withdrew from the case, and he transferred the recordings to Bernardo's newly appointed lawyer, John Rosen, who retained possession for approximately 2 weeks, and then on September 22nd, he turned them over to the police. So 16 months had passed since Carlos' plea bargain was finalized. So the recordings amounted to roughly 3.5 hours of footage documenting for victims Tammy, Homolka, Jane, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French. In graphic detail, the tapes captured the assaults of all of them, and the murders themselves were never recorded, but everything leading up to them wasn't. The tapes revealed the opposite of what Karla had been saying, and they showed active participation. Karla did not appear on those recordings as a terrified woman. Coerced into action, she was a partner in the crimes, and Murray, who viewed the tapes before anyone else outside the couple, described what he saw on Karla's face as feral joy as she took part in the molestation and torture of the victims. She became known as the Black Widow by members of the defense team, and Murray testified that the recording showed Carlos actually assaulting for different female victims, engaging in sexual activity with a female sex worker during a trip to Atlantic City, and they showed her administering drugs to an unconscious victim. Quote, this wasn't a lady who had been subjugated, unquote. Murray said, quote, she was happy, compliant, suggestive, and willing. In my view, the tapes showed Karla as being often the person in control. Nothing on the tape struck me that she was being dominated or coerced, unquote, and Karla's narrative began to crumble. In one tape bore a handwritten label, Karla, Tammy, and me, and the footage showed Karla dressed in her Ed's sister's clothing, having relations with Paul on Tammy's bed, and during the recording she praised him for taking Tammy's virginity, and another part showed the couple intimate while Paul held a photograph of Tammy in his hand, saying, quote, I saw somebody who could be shown as a complete liar, unquote. Murray would say in the image of Karla as the cringing battered wife was exposed for the lie that it was exposed, for the lie that it was tied. So by the time the videotapes finally came to light, the case had already consumed headlines across North America, and in Canada a publication ban had shielded the public from the specifics of Carlos' plea agreement, but American media outlets were free to report whatever they learned, and the internet rendered the ban effectively meaningless, cause when the full truth emerged, the reaction was furious. How you're feeling now while watching this? That was the reaction. Karla was a willing participant, active participant in the torture and saw and murder of multiple young women, one of them being her sister, and by the time the public learned the extent of her involvement, she had already served a portion of her 12-year sentence, and the deal with the devil was known worldwide in editorial boards. Accused prosecutors of handing Karla a lenient sentence for crimes described as, quote, nothing short of monstrous and depraved, unquote, and Crown Attorney Ray Holohan acknowledged publicly that if investigators had recovered the tapes earlier, Karla might well have faced murder charges, but the Crown maintained it had no choice but to honor the agreement. Canada's court system, a fucking trash, because Karla did her part and it couldn't be taken back now, and the outrage grew worse, persisting for more than a decade through appeals, parole hearings, and her highly publicized release in July of 2005, and the legal and ethical fallout extended beyond Karla herself, and Murray was charged with obstruction of justice, thank God, in 2000 following a trial that lasted several weeks, and Murray was acquitted, unfortunately, and presiding Judge Patrick Loss Age said that Murray had retained the recordings for an inordinate and improper period of time. But the case ultimately hinges on questions the legal system had never fully resolved, so this itself ignited a broader debate about the ethical responsibilities of defense counsel when in possession of incriminating physical evidence, and the government inquiry conducted in 1996 concluded that police had made numerous critical errors throughout the investigation, and it found that rivalries and poor coordination between law enforcement agencies had hampered progress at key moments, and it also concluded that some of the crimes might have been prevented fully and entirely if Paul's DNA sample had been fucking processed in a timely manner. So in December of 2001, Canadian authorities ordered the 6 videotapes be destroyed after their legal use had been fulfilled, and on a French Kristen's mother said that when she learned of the decision, she mentally spoke to her daughter, telling her she, quote, didn't have to worry anymore and no one else would ever see what was on those tapes. Only the transcripts remain, and they have never been made available to the public, nor should they ever be made available to the public, in my opinion. So in 1995, Paul finally stood trial, and the proceedings became a national spectacle. Satellite trucks lined the streets outside the courthouse, and crowds gathered daily just for any glimpse of the accused, and security was tightened. The atmosphere was tense, and Paul faced a number of charges to counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Leslie and Kristen, along with 2 counts of kidnapping, forcible confinement, and aggravated assault, and the outcome would determine not only his fate, but whether he would ever be eligible for parole or be designated a dangerous offender and locked away indefinitely. On the prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming, and the Crown attorneys walked the jury through the crimes in chronological sequence, constructing a timeline of escalating violence. The centerpiece of their argument was the videotape evidence, but the recordings were not shown in open court given the extreme nature of their content. The presiding judge restricted viewing to the jury and legal counsel only. Instead, transcripts will read aloud in brief, carefully edited excerpts were displayed, and even in this controlled form, the footage was devastating, and the descriptions alone left no room for second guessing, and Paul's direct involvement in the crimes was undeniable. And another critical voice came from the surviving victim, known only as Jane Doe, who we talked about before, and she testified under a court-protected pseudonym, and her memories of the assaults were only fragments at best, as the drugs had erased most of what had been done to her. But her presence in the courtroom mattered, and her confirmation that she had lost consciousness in the presence of the couple and later learned she had been violated while unconscious reinforced the pattern of predatory serial behavior that prosecutors were working to establish. In Karla's time on the witness stand became one of the most anticipated and unsettling moments of the entire trial, as when she finally appeared before the jury. The courtroom fell silent, and her voice was steady, and she calmly walked through the sequence of horrors she had helped orchestrate, and she acknowledged stealing sedatives from the veterinary clinic at Paul's direction, and she admitted holding halothane soap cloth over her sister Tammy's face, and she confirmed participating in essays of both Leslie and Kristen. And when cross-examination began, Paul's defense attorney went on the attack to destroy Karla's credibility and cast her as an equal partner in the crimes, and maybe even the instigator, and he highlighted contradictions between her early statements to police and what the videotapes had actually captured, and he pressed her on the question of enjoyment, treating aloud transcript passages in which Karla could be heard laughing, making enthusiastic remarks, and expressing what sounded unmistakably like pleasure, and she began to crack and started seeming defensive, and when confronted with her own behavior on the recording, she fell back on her own story, and she was, quote, just saying what Paul wanted to. He run, quote, and observers in the courtroom noted the shift in the mask she had worn so carefully started to slip in. For the first time, the jury and the public glimpsed something closer to the woman captured on those tapes, but still her testimony achieved what the Crown needed it to achieve, and she provided details only someone on the inside could know, and confirmed key facts, and she placed Paul at the center of every crime, and regardless of the doubts the defense raised about her character, her accounts of Paul's actions were damning enough. So the case against Paul was airtight, but what remained to be seen was whether the jury would deliver the verdict the evidence demanded. So following a trial that stretched over for months long, the jury reached its decision, and on September 1st, 1995, Paul Bernardo was found guilty on every single charge. He faced counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of assault, and committing an indignity to a human body, and the deliberations lasted less than a single day, and the judge handed down the maximum sentence permitted under Canadian law, which was life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. But the court went further, and in light of the exceptional brutality of the crimes, prosecutors had requested that Paul be designated a dangerous offender, which is a legal classification in Canada that allows a person to be jailed indefinitely without parole. And the request was thankfully granted, and it intended to ensure that Paul would, in all likelihood, never walk free again. But while Paul's punishment was being pronounced, Karla's fate had already been sealed years earlier by the terms of her plea agreement, and she had already served time at a woman's correctional facility, and the massive distinction between their sentences struck the victims' families like a blow, and Doug French, Kristen's father, called Karla's punishment an outrage, and still he acknowledged that the family at least had the slight comfort from the knowledge that Paul Bernardo would never see daylight again. And the Maha FFIS expressed a similar mixture of relief and lingering anguish, cause they were grateful that Bernardo had been convicted, but the wound left by Karla's deal, in the sense that she had never truly been held accountable for what she had done, remained open. So justice had been served for one of them, and for the other, the question of justice would haunt the public for years to come. So the verdict against Paul did little to quiet the fury surrounding Karla's plea deal, and across Canada the outrage was widespread and unrelenting, and many believed Karla had manipulated the system in order to acquire her deal with the devil, and officials from the Ontario Attorney General's office defended the decision, quote, as distasteful as it is to bargain with an accomplice, it was necessary, unquote, and this explanation did nothing to ease public anger. Not shockingly, and in the years that followed, the case triggered legal reform, and in 2000, Canada established a national DNA database, partly in response to the delay in identifying Paul's DNA, and to prevent similar delays in the future, and police protocols for cross-jurisdictional cooperation were overhauled, ensuring that information about suspects like Paul would be shared more broadly and more quickly, and the case became a staple example of the ethical complexities of plea bargaining and law courses, and culturally the case left its mark on all of Canada, and it became a reference point in debates about sentencing policy, the ethics of publication bans, and the role of female accomplices in violent crimes. The media restrictions imposed during the trial drew particular criticism as American outlets reported freely on the details, while Canadian citizens were barred by court order from learning the full truth of the crimes committed in their own country. This still happens today, by the way, very censored up there in Canada. I can speak to that, love Canada, but it's got its flaws, all right, just like America. America got a lot of flaws to its all shit basically, but anyway, but the nickname Ken and Barbie killers became well known in criminal history. Carrying with it an unsettling lesson: monsters do not always look like monsters, and sometimes they just look like the attractive, smiling young couple next door. And the wound that case left in the Canadian justice system never fully healed, and for many the outcome felt like justice half served, with Paul's punishment to the fullest extent of the law, and Karla given far less than she deserved. But as of now, Paul remains behind bars, still carrying the dangerous offender designation, and he most likely will be held indefinitely regardless of how many years pass, and even so the legal system requires periodic review, and after 25 years, Paul became eligible to apply for parole, and his first hearing took place in 2018, where the board denied his request, citing a complete absence of remorse and high probability that he would reoffend if released, and he applied again in 2021 in another hearing, and in 2023 in another review, and each time was rejected, and the decisions pointed to persistent psychopathic characteristics. No evidence of meaningful rehabilitation, and assessments indicating that his capacity for violence had not diminished with time. The documentation from the hearings noted that Paul continued to harbor sexual fantasies involving teenage girls and for the families of his victims, every hearing has felt like a threat resurfacing, a sad reminder that a man responsible for destroying their lives is still alive and petitioning for freedom. And Doug French, Kristen's father, has publicly described Paul as Canada's most dangerous predator, and the parole board's repeated denials have affirmed that assessment, and as of today the status remains unchanged, and Paul is housed in a maximum security facility where he is monitored closely. And Karla's story after prison is the part that still just doesn't sit right. If she served the full 12 years she had negotiated, and on July 4th, 2005, she walked out of prison a free woman, and her release sparked protests, petitions, and public outcry, and the French and Mahaffey families fought to keep her incarcerated. As mentioned, and thousands of Canadians demanded intervention, but legally there was nothing anyone could do because she had fulfilled the terms of her plea agreement and completed her sentence. And after her release, Karla relocated to Quebec and began the process of erasing herself, and she adopted a new identity, at one point going by the name Emily Cura Tremblay, and in 2005 she married Thierry Bordello, who was the brother of one of the lawyers involved in her case. I'm just gonna go ahead and assume that guy's a monster. To what the couple eventually had 3 children, which is disgusting to think about, cause I weep for those children. Like she's a predator, like are they not checking on them? I don't even understand how this is allowed, but okay anyway. And in 2007, the family left Canada for Guadeloupe, and they returned to Quebec sometime around 2014. But every time her whereabouts became public, and the outrage flared up once more, and in 2017 news reports revealed that Karla had been volunteering at the children's elementary school in Châteauguay, Quebec, and parents' words. Enraged at the idea that a convicted killer of children was chaperoning field trips alongside their own children, and the story made national headlines with the immediate backlash. And since then, Karla has maintained a low profile. Just dig a hole, jump in it, and get someone to bury you in it. How about that, Karla? But she reportedly lives in the suburb of Montreal, occasional, using a different first name to avoid detection. She had formal restrictions attached to her release, including no contact with Paul victims' families or any violent criminals, as well as a few regular check-ins that expired in 2012, so to public knowledge. She has not been involved in any further criminal activity, but the debate has never faded, so I'll ask, should she be free, and the victims' families and much of the public have never stopped saying no, and also me, because in their eyes and my eyes she got away with multiple murders, and her freedom remains a permanent stain on Canada's justice system. Karla herself has offered little that resembles genuine accountability, and in an interview conducted shortly after her release in 2005, she acknowledged her role in the crime, saying, quote, "What I did was terrible, I regret it," unquote. Shut the fuck up, no. You don't. But even then, she's kept up her victim facade, and the narrative she constructed decades ago has never truly changed, and now more than 30 years after the murders, she lives quietly in Quebec, and their children are teenagers, and according to some reports, they remain unaware of their mother's past, though the constant media attention makes that extremely hard to believe. Karla is legally free, and she's rebuilt a life and started a family and avoided the spotlight as much as possible, but she remains one of the most despised women in Canadian history, essentially living in exile and bearing a name that will forever be synonymous with evil. And the Homolkas have never spoken publicly about their loss. Instead, they chose to retreat from view because some wounds just don't close, and I do not blame them at all, and some families simply have to learn to live around the absence. I can't imagine how that family feels, and I can't imagine having a daughter that would do that to your other daughter. I just can't imagine that. I would also like to say that this video, all the proceeds for this video will be going to our victims. I spread across multiple charities that give back to victims. I will tag those down below if you want to check them out. But that is the end of this case. This was a rough one. But you guys suggested it, and if you have any more cases you want me to deep dive into, let me know down below. And until next time, please be safe out there, and I will see your beautiful face in the next one. All right. Bye.